3. On the Normality of Crime. On the Normality of Crime is a chapter heading from a most influential book by the modern sociologist Emile Durkheim, The Rules of Sociological Method. Durkheim's approach should not surprise us. According to the evolutionary worldview, there is no law of God handed down from above to declare what is good and evil, but only a world of chance below which is beyond good and evil, and in which, instead of moral law, we have random variations and developments. From the evolutionary point of view, the idea of the normal can thus mean one or another of, or a variation within, two categories. First, the normal can mean a statistical average. If 51% of the people in a society, or a higher percentage than are either married at the one extreme or celibate at the other, commit adultery, then adultery is normal behavior. It is possible in terms of a statistical concept to declare that in some societies, chastity is abnormal. Second, the normal can mean that which occurs in nature. The Kinsey Research Report on Sexual Behavior rested on this premise. As a result, adultery, homosexuality, child molestation, and other forms of sexual perversion or deviation from God's law became natural and hence normal. Durkheim's approach is essentially the second. He declares, quote, "Crime is normal because a society exempt from it is utterly impossible," end quote. Society is offended by acts which go against its collective sentiment, Durkheim says. These acts can involve bad taste, wrong ideas, theft, murder, or a variety of offences whose punishment can vary from social displeasure to death. Crime is thus defined by Durkheim, as by all evolutionists, as an offence against a relativistic standard. The idea of what constitutes crime changes as society changes. The criminal is thus the man who disagrees with and acts contrary to social standards. This definition could cover, in our evolutionary era, all evangelical Christians, as indeed it does in Marxist countries. The, quote, criminal character, end quote, is not a criminal because there is an absolute truth or law from which he departs, but because he disagrees with society. In Durkheim's words, what confers this character upon them is not the intrinsic quality of a given act, but that definition which the collective conscience lends them. If the collective conscience is stronger, if it has enough authority practically to suppress these divergences, it will also be more sensitive, more exacting, and reacting against the slightest deviations with the energy it otherwise displays only against more considerable infractions, it will attribute to them the same gravity as formerly to crimes. In other words, it will designate them as criminal, end quote. Crime is thus a necessary part of society because deviations from the collective conscience will always occur. But this does not mean that there is any evil inherent in crime or in the criminal. The criminal thus is not a sinner, but a social deviate. His offence is purely relative. In one kind of society, he can be a criminal, and in another, a hero. After all, Durkheim asserts, quote, "It is no longer possible today to dispute the fact that law and morality vary from one social type to the next," end quote. The Old Testament prophets would not have disputed this either. They knew it only too well. Durkheim, however, refuses to acknowledge that the variations are sin and that God's absolute law exists. For him, by definition, only the relative exists. For Durkheim, the collective conscience is a constant factor. Its content changes, but the collective intolerance of deviation is always there to inhibit the individual. At the same time, however, quote, "To make progress, individual originality must be able to express itself. In order that the originality of the idealist whose dreams transcend his century may find expression, it is necessary that the originality of the criminal who is below the level of his time shall also be possible. One does not occur without the other. Nor is this all. Aside from this indirect utility, it happens that crime itself plays a useful role in this evolution. Crime implies not only that the way remains open to necessary changes, but that, in certain cases, it directly prepares these changes. When crime exists, collective sentiments are sufficiently flexible to take on a new form, and crime sometimes helps to determine the form they will take. How many times, indeed, is it only an anticipation of future morality, a step toward what will be? End quote. The criminal must thus be seen in a new light. He is not a totally unsociable being, nor is he an evil creature, but rather a social barometer and an evolutionary pioneer. His offence is not pathological, and this means that it does not require punishment, nor does it call for restitution. Quote, if crime is not pathological at all, the object of punishment cannot be to cure it, and its true function must be sought elsewhere. End quote. Crime is a social, not a moral fact. Quote, the generality of phenomena must be taken as a criterion of their normality. End quote. Here, Durkheim tends to include the first definition of normality. Crime is a natural fact, and it is also a general fact, so that it is doubly a normal aspect of society. It follows, therefore, that what the criminal needs is not condemnation, but understanding. The social deviates has ostensibly been the object of unjust condemnation and should instead receive sympathy and sometimes appreciation. Sigmund Freud, in a letter of the 9th of April 1935, rebuked a mother who was filled with horror and shame because her son was a homosexual. He stated, quote, homosexuality is assuredly no advantage, but it is nothing to be ashamed of, no vice, no degradation. It cannot be classified as an illness. We consider it to be a variation of the sexual function produced by a certain arrest of sexual development. End quote. The idea of a cure was ruled out by Freud. Quote, what analysis can do for your son runs in a different line. If he is unhappy, neurotic, torn by conflicts, inhibited in his social life, analysis can bring him harmony, peace of mind, full efficiency, whether he remains homosexual or gets changed. End quote. Today, of course, Freud's view is bitterly attacked as reactionary because he regarded homosexuality as a form of arrested development. It is now held by many to be merely another form of natural sexual expression. George B. Leonard, formerly a senior editor of Look magazine and also a vice president of Esalen Institute of San Francisco and Big Sur, believes that evolution will work a great transformation in our total outlook. His vision is of, quote, a society without criminals, end quote. Quote, to one whose field of existence has expanded to encompass more than his immediate surroundings, Eugene V. Debs' statement that, quote, while there is a soul in prison, I am not free, end quote, becomes a matter not just of thought and practicality, but also of feeling and being. It becomes clear that people locked up in prisons and animals in zoos reflect something fearful locked up inside of ourselves. Criminals are an essential part of our society and of each of us. Criminality is inextricably bound up with civilization. If the transformation involves relinquishing what is criminal and freeing what is locked up within ourselves, it also involves emptying our prisons. End quote. Lest we miss the point and fail to see how far-reaching his ideas are, Leonard, who is advertised on the book jacket as the father of 4 daughters, titles a key chapter, quote, Beyond Incest, end quote. Although only 3 of 43 pages deal with incest, he makes it clear, however, that he regards, quote, the incest taboo, end quote, as, quote, a good example of our blindness and confusion on sexual matters, end quote. Some cultures have practiced it, and he sees no valid social, genetic, or moral reason against it. He holds that, quote, the flowering of the transformation will probably bring with it a progressive erosion of the incest taboo, end quote. The so-called underground press is busy today promoting every kind of illicit sex, and incest, for example, is strongly favoured in many quarters. Their columns regularly defend incest and or urge it as natural and healthy. In the 15th of March 1974 issue of the LA Star, a woman writes in about her desire to commit incest with her 15-year-old son, whom she caught masturbating into her discarded panties. The position of Mrs. Robinson was in part this, quote, I believe what is natural is right. Our society believes what is unnatural is natural. Nature does not care that anyone is related to anyone else. That was started in this society because of birth defects. We have that anyway, so I don't see that it is necessary to discriminate against relatives. What nature says is right, our society says is against the law. End quote. Because cleanliness, like laws against incest, is a refusal to accept the natural world as normative, many hippies and underground papers ridicule cleanliness and all distaste for bad odours. It is ironic that lack of cleanliness has reached such proportions among such people that their odours have become unendurable by their own description. The LA Star devotes all of page 6 of the 15th of March 1974 number to instructions in the use of toilet tissue, not used on principle by many, and the suggestion, quote, change your underpants at least twice a week, end quote. The totally natural world is thus not entirely tolerable even to its own champions. Turning once again to the normality of crime, we can see something of the factors which, in recent years, have led college youths and liberals to regard rioting criminals as heroes. Having denied the idea of crime, they will naturally find allies in any circle bent on warfare against existing society, which still clings to the idea that some offences are wrong. How extensively the ideas of Durkheim and others have infected our culture can also be seen in the following illustration. On October the 7th, 1973, I spoke to at least 200 students at a major university. Unlike most college and university groups I've spoken to, this was an entirely evangelical group. In discussing the doctrine of original sin, I asked how many had read Durkheim in the course of a classroom assignment. Almost all hands went up. I asked how many had read the chapter in the Rules of Sociological Method entitled On the Normality of Crime. Only one hand went up. I suggested that perhaps the reading of such a chapter would cause problems in their somewhat conservative state, and hence the bypassing of it by their professors. I then described the contents of that chapter and asked the students to raise their hands if, to any measurable degree, the perspective and idea of that chapter had been conveyed to them in the past. Again, almost all raised their hands. After the meeting, one student after another admitted to me that he or she, girls were more honest about admitting this, had been heavily brainwashed in their views of crime by this evolutionary approach. Such an example makes it clear how radically different education is under evolutionary presuppositions and under biblical presuppositions. We cannot underestimate the social damage caused by secular education. Neither can we permit churchmen to believe that it is other than morally wrong to turn their children and youths over to status schools and secular universities. If the evolutionary mythology is both false and morally wrong, how much more wrong is it to turn our children over to the high priests of an evil faith?